Hong Kong, 1974. Beneath the glare of fluorescent lights, Sik-Ho sits in handcuffs as cameras flash over mountains of heroin stacked like tombstones. Once the untouchable king of Asia's drug trade, he now faces the weight of colonial law, his empire reduced to evidence tags. To understand how a boy from Fujian became Hong Kong's king of heroin, we must trace the path that led him from hunger and exile to power, and finally, to downfall. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. Thick with diesel fumes rising from the harbour and the chatter of Cantonese hawkers setting up stalls along Nathan Road. It is a city straining under its own contradictions, neon and poverty, British law and triad law, fortunes made in banking towers and fortunes made in backroom heroin labs. On this particular morning, one man finds himself at the centre of both worlds, his empire collapsing in a flash of cameras and the shuffle of polished police boots. Sik-Ho, once untouchable, now stands handcuffed beneath the pitiless glare of fluorescent lights in the Narcotics Bureau headquarters. His dark suit, tailored and central, is creased from the rough handling of detectives. The air smells of stale cigarettes and chemical dust, drifting from the heaps of pure heroin stacked on wooden pallets before him. It is a seizure so vast that even veteran reporters draw sharp breaths when the tarpaulin is pulled back. Block after block of white powder, more than half a ton, its value measured in ruined lives across Hong Kong, New York, Saigon. Photographers jostle, their bulbs popping like distant gunfire, the echo bouncing through the station's tiled corridors. Does not flinch. His face remains a mask carved from granite, eyes slightly narrowed as if weighing the absurdity of it all. To the gathered press, the British superintendent offers words heavy with finality. We believe this man is the central artery of heroin distribution in Asia, Inspector Ian Rankin declared, 1974. It is a statement meant as a death sentence for a criminal career, and yet known in whispers as Limpy Ho, seems to wear it almost as a crown. In that moment, he is still a king, though his throne is a wooden bench, and his empire reduced to evidence tags. An officer pushes a packet toward the cameras, its seal stamped with red Chinese characters. A South China Morning Post headline already waits in the presses. Police net heroin kingpin in record raid. The words will thunder across breakfast tables by dawn, but here in the echoing room, the detail is smaller, sharper. The sheen of sweat on Ng's temple as the press lights burn hot. The soft squeak of his Italian leather shoes as he shifts against his cuffs. He is not a man unused to scrutiny. Nightclubs in Wan Chai once bent their lighting to flatter him, but this is scrutiny of a different kind, stripping power instead of affirming it. The empire he built had seeped into every street of Kowloon. Heroin, refined in secret factories hidden behind shuttered warehouses, had spread like smoke through the veins of a city already addicted to its own speed. By the early 1970s, 10% of Hong Kong's youth were estimated to be addicts. American GIs flying back from the Vietnam front carried his product home in duffel bags. The United Nations report that same year described Hong Kong as a critical hub in the flow of Southeast Asian heroin, a line that could have been written with in mind. And yet, amid this sweeping tide, he remained an enigma, disciplined, deliberate, never one for flamboyant violence. Allegedly, he once told an associate in a Kowloon tea house, "Blood invites attention, money builds empires." Source, Oral History Interview, 1982. That philosophy had insulated him for years, until the city itself shifted beneath his feet. By the mid-1970s, the British colonial government, long accused of tolerating triad power, faced mounting pressure from Washington. American officials demanded action, insisting Hong Kong was feeding an epidemic that had gutted Harlem and the Bronx. The newly formed Narcotics Bureau, staffed by men hardened in Belfast and Glasgow, turned its gaze on wiretaps hummed in the night. Informants whispered in Shek Kip Mei, and slowly the invisible net tightened. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. A dawn raid on a Kowloon go-down, uniformed officers swarming in as startled dockworkers scattered. But its symbolism was enormous. Ng's closest bodyguard, a heavy-set man from Guangzhou known as Fat Wah, was taken down in the same sweep. A scar across his jaw told of earlier battles, but in 1974 he surrendered without a shot. For years, Wah had been the shadow at Ng's shoulder. the man who drove him through Tsim Sha Tsui in a black Mercedes, the man who whispered warnings before a deal soured. His silent presence that morning, head bowed as he was led away, underscored the collapse. Even loyalty, it seemed, could not withstand the machinery of empire crumbling. The press recorded every angle. In one photograph, Ung stares directly at the camera, lips pressed into a thin line, as if challenging history to remember him on his own terms. Behind him, sacks of heroin loom higher than his shoulders, dwarfing the man once said to move $1 billion Hong Kong dollars worth of narcotics each year. To one side, a British detective scribbles notes on a clipboard, a scratch of his pen oddly loud in the charged silence. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious. Tram bells clanged on Daewoo Road, and in tea houses men readied their morning dim sum. But in this room the atmosphere was thick, final, almost funereal. Geographically, the spectacle played out less than a mile from Queen's Road, where colonial bankers counted fortunes under chandeliers. The irony was stark. On one side of the city, white powder fueling despair. On the other, white shirts tallying profits that also owed something to the underworld's invisible hand. For decades, Hong Kong's economy had lived in the shadows of both legality and vice. Now, the balance tilted. As officers led him down a narrow stairwell, the sensory world shifted again. The damp smell of concrete, the metallic jangle of keys, the faint strains of a transistor radio crackling Cantonese pop from a nearby office. Each detail emphasized the fall. Ung descended slowly, his limp noticeable, a legacy of childhood illness that had earned him the nickname Limpy Ho. Reporters shouted questions, their voices bouncing off stone walls. He did not answer. He had built an empire by holding his tongue, by saying less than he knew. Yet the silence spoke volumes. In that pause, he seemed to acknowledge the end of something vast, an empire constructed not just of drugs but of fear, loyalty, and the peculiar alchemy of Hong Kong's underworld. One journalist present later recalled, "He looked at us as if we were children playing a game, and he was already thinking beyond us." South China Morning Post interview, 1975. The remark captured the paradox. A man cornered, yet still projecting a kind of authority. The convoy of police vehicles pulled into the humid night, headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the harbour. Crowds gathered at a distance, drawn less by curiosity than by the magnetism of downfall. Some whispered admiration, others contempt. To many, Ung embodied the contradictions of their city. Ruthless, but disciplined. A criminal, but a builder of wealth. A destroyer, yet a product of the same poverty and upheaval that shaped millions of refugees. As the door slammed behind him at the precinct, the sound echoed like the clang of a closing vault. The king of heroin, the man who once directed rivers of white powder across oceans, was now just another prisoner in the custody of colonial law. The cameras had captured the image that would define him for generations. A man dwarfed by the very commodity that made him powerful. It was an image of empire turned to evidence, of pride bent into posture, of a crown reduced to handcuffs. The story of Sik-Ho begins in this moment of fall, and every step backward into his past only deepens the question of how he came to rule, and why he had to fall. Fujian Province, 1933. A boy is born into a world already unraveling, where rice paddies tremble under the boots of Japanese troops and families whisper of hunger as often as they do of prayer. The Ung household was modest, their walls thin against the bitter winter wind, the smell of boiled cabbage drifting into streets littered with broken tools and discarded shoes. In those formative years, survival was not an abstract notion, but a daily negotiation, and the boy who would one day be known as Sik-Ho learned early that dignity and despair could occupy the same room. The Japanese invasion, beginning in earnest in 1937, brought waves of refugees and soldiers through Fujian, their uniforms coarse, their rifles cold, their presence heavy with menace. He was still a child, but the rattle of distant gunfire and the acrid smoke of burned villages carved themselves into his memory. By the time the war ended in 1945, China itself was in ruins, torn between nationalist and communist forces. Fujian was a province of hardship, its young men disappearing into armies or gangs, its markets filled with counterfeit goods, cigarettes smuggled in from British colonies, and whispers of opium carried on the salt air from neighbouring ports. Ung's father, like so many in those years, turned his eyes to the south, to Hong Kong, the British colony that had become a strange sanctuary for the desperate. For a family of limited means, it was a perilous journey, but the alternative was starvation. Allegedly, Ng's mother once told a relative, he was quiet, watchful, not easily fooled. Even as a boy, he had a merchant's eyes. Oral history interview, 1978. Those eyes studied the uncertainty of migration as the family packed their belongings, each bundle tied with fraying rope, their footsteps heavy on the dirt paths leading to the coast. The crossing into Hong Kong in the late 1940s was a baptism into chaos. The colony had survived Japanese occupation but was unrecognizable, scarred and overcrowded. Refugees poured across the border daily, some carrying little more than a change of clothes, others dragging stolen furniture down Nathan Road, their faces blank with exhaustion. The Hong Kong Gazette captured the scale with sobering precision in 1949. Tens of thousands flood the city daily, swelling its underworld. On the streets of Kowloon, the sounds were overwhelming. Rickshaw bells, hawkers shouting prices for fish still slick with seawater, and radios humming Mandarin ballads beneath the neon signs flickering into life each night. The city was alive. The life was brittle, held together by hustlers and gamblers who thrived in the gaps left by war. For young Ng, the smells of Hong Kong were intoxicating and contradictory. The sweetness of roasting chestnuts mixed with the reek of refuse along Sham Shui Po's alleys. The perfume of British women stepping into trams clashed with the sweat of coolies unloading crates at the docks. It was a city where survival demanded adaptability. His schooling was brief, cut short by necessity, and the Triads loomed as a force both feared and admired. The 14K and Sun Yi, and societies prowled the refugee neighborhoods, their tattoos and swagger both a threat and a promise. Allegedly, a street elder once remarked, the boy knew when to keep his mouth shut, and in Hong Kong that's half the battle. Retold in police interviews, 1961. By the midpoint of the 1940s, Ng's family had settled in Kowloon, where tenement housing rose like concrete hives. The walls were damp, radios buzzed with static, and the stairwells always smelled of boiled rice and unfiltered double happiness cigarettes. It was here that he began to notice the economy of shadows, the black markets thriving behind closed doors, the quick exchanges of cash and ration coupons, the men who disappeared into gambling dens and emerged with fortunes or nothing. Triad recruiters saw opportunity in boys like Ng, quick with their hands and quicker with their instincts. He did not yet hold power, but his watchfulness and calm demeanor marked him as someone who could. The British administration, though restored after the war, was overstretched and uninterested in the small hustles of migrant neighborhoods. Corruption flowed through police precincts like water, and for a teenager like Ng, the law was less a barrier than a bargaining partner. The broader organized crime landscape of Asia was also shifting. The old opium routes from Yunnan and Burma were adapting to post-war demand, while Hong Kong became the logistical hub that no one could ignore. Ng grew up not simply in a city of opportunity, but in the capital of survival itself, where hunger met ambition, and the underworld offered a ladder that, for the daring, climbed higher than any colonial institution could. A vivid moment from those years remains etched in local law. A food riot in 1946 outside a ration depot in Kowloon City. Ng was there, just a teenager in worn canvas shoes, pressed into a crowd that surged against the gates as police tried to hold them back. He watched men fight over sacks of rice, saw mothers clutching babies while begging for scraps. The micro detail that lingered, he later told an acquaintance, was the way a single grain of rice stuck to his sweat-damp palm as the riot dissolved into chaos. That memory, small but indelible, became his silent reminder that scarcity was the harshest master of all. By the close of the decade, Hong Kong had settled into a volatile rhythm, prosperity glittering in Central, desperation festering in the squatter huts of Shek Kip Mei, and the Triads bridging the two with a mixture of terror and commerce. It was in this crucible that Ng's path began to take shape, his ambitions sharpened by the contradictions around him. He had seen a homeland consumed by war, had felt hunger gnaw through the marrow, and now stood in a city where power belonged not to the righteous but to the ruthless. The streets buzzed with the rhythm of Cantonese opera leaking from tea houses, the clatter of typewriters in the South China Morning Post newsroom, the faint hum of an underworld rising alongside legitimate trade. The boy from Fujian was no longer just a refugee. He was becoming a man shaped by disorder, a figure who understood that in Hong Kong's post-war frenzy, the lines between law and lawlessness were so thin they could be walked like a tightrope. As the decade closed, he had already stepped onto that rope, balancing survival with ambition, listening to the city's contradictions as though they were a language only he could master. And in the echoes of wartime chaos that still clung to Fujian and Hong Kong alike, Sik-Ho carried forward the lesson of his beginnings. The power is born in scarcity, and empires, like riots, often start with hunger. Kowloon, 1952. The city was still a place of refugees and ruins, but by night its streets pulsed with a different kind of energy, when neon tubes buzzed above crumbling tenements and the smell of cheap sandalwood incense mingled with the bitter tang of state-run double happiness cigarettes. In the narrow alleys of Yau Ma Tei and Sham Shui Po, mahjong tiles clicked like rainfall in smoky parlors. Dice rolled across stained felt tables, and fortunes were won or lost in the time it took a match to burn out. For a young man like Sik-Ho, barely in his 20s, the streets of Kowloon offered no illusions of morality, only a choice between being exploited or learning to exploit. He chose the latter, and in that choice, the path toward the Triads began to harden beneath his feet. The 14K, one of Hong Kong's most powerful societies, dominated these neighborhoods, their influence stretching from gambling dens hidden above noodle shops to opium parlors perfumed with sweet smoke along Temple Street. They were born out of political exile and hardened by colonial neglect, and by the 1950s they had become the silent governors of the underworld. Restless and ambitious, gravitated toward them not with bravado, but with calculation. He had seen men rise on fists alone, only to vanish in pools of blood on Mongkok's sidewalks. What drew him in was their structure, their discipline, the way they mixed violence with ceremony. Allegedly, an older cousin whispered to him over bowls of congee, "The 14K don't just fight, they run the city's veins." Family Interview, 1979. That idea, a society that thought in systems rather than skirmishes, captured him as surely as hunger once had. Began as a runner, carrying envelopes and messages between dens. His silence was his greatest currency. Where other boys boasted of connections, kept his head down, memorizing faces, debts, and loyalties. He became known for his reliability, the kind of foot soldier who did not pocket a single extra dollar, who delivered every sum to the cent. Such discipline was rare in a world of temptation, and it brought him to the notice of mid-level bosses who valued discretion. A Triad elder, later quoted in a police interview from the 1960s, put it bluntly, had a head for business, not just fists. That made him dangerous. His danger lay not in hot-blooded violence, but in the cold arithmetic of power. By the mid-1950s, he was trusted enough to enforce debts in Kowloon's mahjong halls. The work was brutal, yet approached it with a calm that unsettled those around him. He never raised his voice, never brandished a blade unnecessarily. Instead, he would sit across from a delinquent gambler, tap the edge of his cigarette into a chipped porcelain ashtray, and explain the mathematics of owing the 14K. Those who paid walked away intact. Those who didn't often ended up beaten in alleyways, where the only witnesses were stray dogs. One such night, as rain slicked the tiles of Portland Street, watched quietly as a rival was dragged out of a mahjong parlor. The vivid moment that seared into memory was not the violence itself, but the sight of a red silk tie, ruined and stained in the gutter, a symbol of pride reduced to garbage. For it was proof that appearances meant nothing without control. The geographical heart of this new life was Jordan Road, where gambling houses, brothels, and tea shops wove a tapestry of temptation and despair. The colonial police maintained a presence, but corruption was endemic. Envelopes stuffed with cash ensured raids were announced in advance. The South China Morning Post, in a 1956 headline, captured the paradox bluntly. Police crack down on vice as dens reopen within hours. For the lesson was simple. Power lay not in evading authority, but in managing it, bending it to your advantage. His rise in the 14K coincided with the society's expansion into narcotics, and he became a trusted intermediary, smoothing quarrels and organizing shipments with an efficiency that belied his age. The sensory world of his ascent was unmistakable. By the midpoint of the decade, the jukeboxes in Mongkok cafes were playing Mandarin ballads and American swing, while cigarette smoke turned the ceiling beams brown. The texture of cash, worn, greasy banknotes passing hand to hand, became as familiar to him as prayer beads to a monk. One micro detail lingered. Always folded his notes lengthwise before pocketing them, an old Fujian habit which marked him as different among Hong Kong natives who folded theirs crosswise. Small as it was, The gesture became a signature, noticed by both allies and rivals. His contradictions deepened with power. Though ruthless in business, he was known to show a quiet loyalty to those who served him well, arranging medical care for one enforcer's family and discreetly paying funeral expenses for another. Allegedly, he once told a junior member, "Money stays with those who keep others alive." Oral testimony, 1984. This pragmatism earned him loyalty in a culture where betrayal was a constant shadow. By 1958, his status had shifted. No longer merely a runner or an enforcer, he had become a fixer, a man others turned to when disputes risked tearing profitable operations apart. His power status snapshot could be captured in one line. Ng was now the quiet hand that settled arguments before they became wars. Law enforcement, however, had begun to take notice. A 1959 police report described him as a young organizer with unusual influence for his age. Hong Kong Police Archives, 1959. For British officers accustomed to loud, reckless gangsters, Ng's methodical rise was unsettling. He did not seek headlines, yet his name began to circulate in the back rooms of the Narcotics Bureau, mentioned with caution alongside older, more flamboyant bosses. As the decade closed, Ng's world was one of neon and shadow. The Kowloon alleys where he once delivered envelopes were now places where men bowed slightly as he passed. He wore tailored suits from Nathan Road tailors, yet his shoes were always polished by hand, a reminder of his Fujian upbringing. By night, he moved through mahjong parlors filled with smoke, where the click of tiles was interrupted only by the rustle of cash. The smell of sandalwood lingered in his clothes, masking the less savory odors of blood and fear. And in the half-light of those Kowloon streets, where neon signs flickered above rain-slick pavement, embodied the paradox of his rise. A man shaped by chaos, yet defined by discipline. A gangster who understood that true danger was not in the swing of a fist, but in the patience to wait, to calculate, to strike only when certain. The lure of the Triads was never just power. It was the promise of control in a city that otherwise offered none. And as the mahjong tiles clattered through another smoky night, that sound became the rhythm of his ascent. Kowloon, 1958. The air in the alleys no longer carried the same perfume of burning opium that had hung heavy for decades. The bamboo mats of old smoking dens were being rolled up, their lamps extinguished, their regulars driven to stronger poisons. Across Asia, the drug trade itself was shifting. Where once the slow haze of opium defined an addict's night, heroin now promised potency, portability, and profits on a scale the old dens could not rival. For Sik-Ho, whose ascent through the 14K had taught him that the true art of power lay in recognizing change before others dared to name it, this was no collapse. It was an opening. The neon lights of Portland Street reflected off damp cobblestones, but in Ng's mind, those same streets now gleamed with the glint of white powder. The sensory world of the late 50s was one of transition. Tea houses still carried the smoky aroma of State Express 555 cigarettes, but whispered deals over their wooden tables concerned not pipes of opium, but packages of crystalline heroin. Ng listened. He cultivated contacts among smugglers from Yunnan, traders who claimed ties to Burmese militias, men who spoke in half-truths while sipping baijiu in Sham Shui Po taverns. Allegedly, one veteran courier remarked in confidence, "He never wasted words, but he remembered every number." Oral testimony, 1976. Those numbers, quantities, prices, routes, became the blueprint of an empire, not yet visible, but already forming. By the turn of the 1960s, Ng was arranging shipments from the Golden Triangle, that vast, unruly region where Burma, Laos, and Thailand bled into one another, ruled less by governments than by warlords. There, Kuomintang remnants and local militias financed their battles with opium, refining it into morphine base and moving it down rugged trails into Thailand. Ng positioned himself as the indispensable link between those producers and the hungry markets of Hong Kong. He did not travel to the jungle himself. His strength lay in delegation, in turning others' risks into his gains. Trusted lieutenants, among them a wiry enforcer known as Little Wah, carried his instructions southward, their satchels stuffed with cash and promises. Wah, once a street fighter, found himself shaking hands with men in military fatigues, the barrels of carbines leaning casually against bamboo walls as transactions were sealed. Back in Kowloon, Ng oversaw the creation of clandestine laboratories hidden inside ordinary tenement blocks. The vivid moment came when, in 1961, Police raided a supposed textile workshop in Tokwawan and found instead a full heroin refinery, its air thick with acrid chemical fumes, acetone and ether soaking into the cracked concrete floor. The South China Morning Post headline read the next morning: "Drug plant found in tenement block, 3 arrested." No one dared name but those in the underworld whispered who had financed the operation. For him, each raid was a cost of doing business, the loss of one workshop offset by the quiet opening of another. The micro detail that characterized his oversight was his insistence that all workers wear cloth gloves, not for safety, but to ensure that fingerprints could never betray them. Geographically, Hong Kong in these years was perfectly placed. Ships steamed from Victoria Harbour to San Francisco and Vancouver. Cargo holds crowded with textiles, electronics, and, hidden within, packets of heroin small enough to escape even the most diligent customs inspection. The city's status as a British colony provided both cover and corruption. Police precincts in Mongkok and Tsim Sha Tsui overflowed with officers whose salaries left them vulnerable to bribes, and understood the value of a regular envelope delivered quietly at month's end. A United Nations narcotics report in 1962 declared with stark clarity, Hong Kong is a critical hub in the flow of Southeast Asian heroin. For that statement was not a condemnation, but a confirmation. The world had noticed what he had already built. A sensory midpoint of this transformation could be found in the soundtrack of the city itself. Jukeboxes in Wan Chai bars played imported rock and roll records, Elvis Presley crooning above the chatter of sailors, while in the back rooms, Triad negotiators scribbled figures on matchbook covers. The smell of kerosene stoves from street hawkers mixed with the sharp chemical tang of heroin processing drifting from hidden flats. Navigated both worlds with the same composure, equally at ease in a mahjong parlor or a meeting with foreign traders. Allegedly, he told an associate in 1960, "Heroin is the future because it travels further than men do." Police informant notes, 1964. The remark revealed his calculation. Opium tied addicts to a pipe. Heroin tied entire continents to a powder. His contradictions grew sharper as his influence spread. Outwardly, he lived with restraint, avoiding the flamboyance of rivals who paraded mistresses through Nathan Road nightclubs. But beneath the surface, he pursued expansion with relentless ambition. His power status snapshot by the early 1960s was simple. Had become the broker every supplier wanted and every dealer feared. A man whose quiet nod could move shipments across oceans. At his side, figures like Little Wah enforced discipline, ensuring no one skimmed from the syndicate's profits. Loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal was met with sudden disappearance into the harbour's dark waters. Law enforcement, both colonial and international, began to tighten its gaze. The American Bureau of Narcotics circulated memos identifying Hong Kong as a primary source of heroin flooding into US cities. The headlines in New York mirrored those in Asia, warning of an epidemic whose roots stretched across the Pacific. Within Hong Kong, whispers grew that Ng's network was not just another triad racket, but an organized system operating with military precision. To police officers already overwhelmed by vice, his name became shorthand for the invisible empire no one could yet topple. As the early 1960s unfolded, the consequences of this shift rippled outward. Addicts crowded the back alleys of Mongkok, veins scarred, eyes hollow. Profits ballooned, but so too did the attention of rivals eager to seize a share of the trade. Responded, not with reckless violence, but with the same patience that had carried him from errand boy to enforcer. A belief that empire was built in silence, in shadows, in the slow tightening of control. And in the final image of this era, the sensory world returned with unnerving clarity. In a Kowloon workshop, a radio crackled with Cantonese opera, as men in undershirts stirred boiling vats of morphine base, the steam carrying both sweetness and poison into the humid night. Outside, neon signs flickered over Temple Street, promising fortune to gamblers, even as they masked the ruin being packaged upstairs. It was in these clandestine rooms that completed his transformation, from a triad fixer enforcing debts to the architect of a narcotics empire. The opium lamps had gone out, but in their place, a harsher, whiter flame had been lit, one that would carry both his fortune and his doom. Hong Kong, 1965. The colony was booming, cranes clawing at the skyline while cargo ships crowded Victoria Harbour, their horns echoing against the hills of Kowloon. Beneath this glittering surface, another empire thrived, invisible yet omnipresent. An empire measured not in tons of steel or textile exports, but in the delicate weight of powdered heroin moving through hidden pipelines. At its center stood Sik-Ho, no longer a quiet fixer in the shadows, but the recognized kingpin of a trade worth billions. The smell of diesel from freighters mixed with the sweetness of roasted chestnuts from street vendors. But in Ng's world, the scent most familiar was the sharp chemical tang of heroin bricks freshly cut and packaged. His network now stretched like an unbroken chain from the jungles of the Golden Triangle to the neon avenues of Hong Kong and outward to Macau, Vancouver, and New York. The profits were staggering. Reinvested them with the cold precision of a banker and the bravado of a showman. Nightclubs in Wan Chai bore his imprint, where jukeboxes played imported Motown singles, while sailors in white uniforms danced with local girls. Hotels along Nathan Road quietly received his guests, while shipping companies under his front names moved containers across oceans. A vivid scene captured the transformation. A gleaming black Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud idling outside a Kowloon Triad clubhouse, its chrome reflecting neon kanji as stepped out in a tailored suit, flanked by bodyguards whose cigarette smoke curled like banners into the night. The sensory world of his reign was unmistakable. By the mid-60s, the air inside Triad clubhouses was thick with smoke from unfiltered red pagoda cigarettes, the lacquered tables sticky with spilled rice wine. Mahjong tiles clattered as his lieutenants whispered figures, balancing ledgers that stretched from Mongkok to Montreal. At the midpoint of the decade, Ng's wealth insulated him, even from the whispers of betrayal. Allegedly, one associate recalled him saying, "A man who controls heroin controls the hunger of nations." Oral testimony, 1987. It was not boastful, but reflective, an acknowledgement of the global tide he now directed. Geographically, his dominion had grown beyond Hong Kong itself. In Macau, casinos provided both laundering and leisure, and Ng's presence was felt in the shadows behind baccarat tables. In North America, Triad couriers linked with local syndicates, moving his product into Harlem and Chinatown alike. A 1969 issue of Time magazine noted bluntly, "Hong Kong has a godfather in all but name, Sik-Ho." For the Western world, he had become the face of a narcotics empire that was no longer confined to Asia's alleys, but embedded in the veins of New York's addicts. Amid this growth, his contradictions became sharper. Outwardly disciplined, avoiding flamboyant public displays, he nonetheless cultivated symbols of wealth as tools of power. His suits were cut on Queen's Road, his wrist adorned with a Rolex, his car a moving fortress. Yet those close to him noticed smaller habits that revealed the boy from Fujian beneath the kingpin. He still folded every banknote lengthwise before pocketing it, and at dinners he preferred plain rice and soy-braised pork to the lobster and cognac his lieutenants ordered. That micro-detail, the folding of a note, remained constant even as his empire expanded, a quiet gesture of control in a life that demanded appearances. Law enforcement, both colonial and foreign, could not ignore him. The Hong Kong Standard ran a headline in 1967, "Police warn of expanding narcotics trade amid rising violence." Behind the cautious wording, investigators knew who orchestrated the expansion. American agents in Saigon and Bangkok whispered of Ng's fingerprints on shipments that reached GIs during the Vietnam War. Within the colony, his influence seeped into police precincts where envelopes of cash softened scrutiny, and into courts where witnesses mysteriously recanted. A British detective later observed, "He was never loud, never careless, but his reach was everywhere." Hong Kong Police Oral History, 1978. At his side throughout these years was a trusted driver and confidant, a man known simply as Ming, who had been with him since his early days in Kowloon. Ming's presence was constant, opening the Rolls-Royce door, running messages, waiting patiently outside smoky clubhouses until dawn. Though rarely mentioned, his loyalty embodied the aura commanded, where even secondary figures lived as extensions of his will. The devotion was sustained not by fear alone, but by the sense that under there was order, a dangerous but dependable order in a chaotic city. The sensory midpoint of his empire could be felt in Wan Chai's nightlife. American rock seeped from jukeboxes, the smell of fried squid filled the sidewalks, and in back rooms, contracts were signed in silence with a nod and a glass of whiskey. Walked through these worlds with the composure of a man both feared and needed. His power status snapshot in the 1960s was simple. Sik-Ho had become the broker between Asia's drug fields and the West's insatiable demand, the man whose empire was measured not in territory, but in supply routes. And yet, the more he expanded, the more fragile the foundation became. Rivals eyed his dominance, police files thickened with his name, and foreign governments began to push Hong Kong's colonial rulers for visible action. For now, though, he remained untouchable, his Rolls-Royce sliding through Kowloon's rain-slick streets like a ship through dark waters, the neon reflections dancing across its polished hood. The smoky Triad clubhouses still whispered his name with awe, and the mahjong tiles clattering deep into the night still marked the rhythm of his reign. It was in those moments, beneath buzzing neon and within the haze of cigarette smoke, that the kingpin fully emerged. No longer just a disciplined enforcer or a clever intermediary, Sik-Ho had become Hong Kong's godfather in all but name, his empire sprawling across continents, his wealth woven into the colony's glittering facade. And as the Rolls-Royce idled once more outside a smoky clubhouse, its engine low and steady, it seemed the car itself had become a symbol. Luxury perched at the curb of vice, waiting patiently for the king of heroin to take his place inside. Burma, 1967. The humid air of the Shan Hills clung heavy to the skin, thick with the smell of damp earth, gun oil, and freshly cut poppies glistening red and white under the sun. Here, in the lawless zone where Burma, Thailand, and Laos converged, power did not wear uniforms of government, but fatigues of militia commanders, and the language of trade was written in rifles and sacks of raw opium. This was the Golden Triangle, and Sik-Ho, already enthroned as Hong Kong's kingpin, now sought to crown his empire with direct access to its beating heart. He had outgrown middlemen, and in the shifting geopolitics of the Cold War, he saw that heroin could move faster than ideology, richer than politics, stronger than law. The region was a paradox of chaos and order. Kuomintang remnants, driven from China after 1949, patrolled its mountains, financing their survival through opium fields. Local warlords raised private armies to protect their crops, while CIA-backed militias, supplied with weapons to fight communism, turned those same arms towards safeguarding caravans of narcotics. Amid this collision of interests, Ng's emissaries arrived with money, precision, and promises of markets beyond imagination. Allegedly, one courier remembered, the Shan Hills smelled of poppies and cordite, but Ng's men only talked numbers. Oral History, 1981. They brought charts, weights, and advance payments, transforming the tribal harvest into a commodity destined for Western veins. The sensory world of these negotiations was vivid. Camps echoed with the clatter of typewriters manned by Chinese exiles calculating shipments, the static crackle of American rock drifting from portable radios carried by CIA-trained soldiers, the acrid smoke of Burmese cheroots curling through bamboo huts. Never ventured into the jungles himself, but his envoys, men like Little Wah, sat cross-legged across from Khun Sa, the Shan warlord, who would later be called the Prince of Death. In these meetings, silver bars, US dollars, and gold trinkets exchanged hands. Micro details lingered. The way Khun Sa's men polished their rifles with scraps of cloth while discussing quotas, or how Ng's emissaries stacked their notes lengthwise, a habit he had instilled in them, an echo of his Fujian discipline. By 1969, Ng's empire was integrated directly into Golden Triangle production. Heroin was refined in jungle laboratories, powered by makeshift generators, their vats bubbling with morphine base processed into pure No. 4 heroin, the potent white powder that addicts in New York and Saigon craved. Convoys of mules and trucks carried it across the Mekong under armed guard, into Thailand, and onward to Hong Kong, where Ng's syndicate oversaw distribution. At the midpoint of this trade, Victoria Harbour became the exit point. Cargo ships laden with textiles and manufactured goods concealed packets of heroin tucked inside hollowed-out furniture, false-bottom crates, and even canned goods. The sensory overlay of Hong Kong in these years was stark. The smell of diesel from freighters, the clinking of mahjong tiles in Kowloon parlours, and in hidden corners, the sterile chemical sting of heroin bricks sealed in wax paper. Geographically, Hong Kong had become indispensable. The city's banking system provided safe channels for laundering, while its free port status made customs porous. A DEA briefing in 1971 captured the truth without embellishment. Without Hong Kong Triads, Golden Triangle heroin has no pipeline to the west. Had become the broker between worlds, translating jungle harvests into Wall Street profits for bankers who never asked questions about deposits arriving from Macau casinos or Vancouver front companies. His power status snapshot in this period was clear. He was no longer merely Hong Kong's drug lord, but the indispensable artery connecting the fields of Shan State to the streets of Harlem. Yet contradictions persisted. Ung prided himself on discipline, on avoiding the flamboyant violence that drew police raids. But he now trafficked in product that brought mass addiction, collapse, and death. His ambitions demanded expansion, but with expansion came exposure. American newspapers began to print headlines such as "Asian heroin floods U.S. cities," New York Times, 1971, while Hong Kong papers warned of a growing epidemic among the colony's youth. Colonial police files thickened, and whispers grew louder that Ung's reach extended into every alley and every precinct. Allegedly, Ung remarked to an associate, "The West calls it poison, but their hunger makes it gold." Witness testimony, 1974. In that reflection, his paradox sharpened, cynicism mixed with clarity, a man both condemning and exploiting the demand that made him rich. At the midpoint of the 1970s, the sensory weight of his empire could be felt in Kowloon's nightclubs. Jukeboxes played Mandarin love songs as his lieutenants sipped whiskey, their suits perfumed with imported cologne, while in back rooms, ledgers tracked shipments worth millions. Outside, the sound of tram bells and the sweet smell of egg tarts reminded the colony of its everyday life. But within these rooms, global history was being written in powder and blood. At his side remained Ming, his loyal driver, who ferried him from meetings to discreet villas in Kowloon Tong. Ming, invisible to the world, was the one who ensured Ung's movements remained seamless. His presence felt everywhere, yet seen rarely. The broader organized crime landscape reflected this transformation. Italian-American mob families in New York and New Jersey now depended on heroin routed through Hong Kong, while Vietnamese syndicates in Saigon connected soldiers with Ung's product during the Vietnam War. The Golden Triangle connection was not just a regional story, it was the artery of a global epidemic. American GIs carried his heroin home in duffel bags, their addictions spreading the empire's reach, even as politicians denounced it. And yet, amid the scale of his operations, Ung remained cautious, even fearful. He knew warlords could turn, militias could collapse, governments could intervene. He trusted money more than men, and systems more than promises. This paranoia kept him alive, but it also isolated him, sealing him into an empire where loyalty was fragile and betrayal a constant shadow. As the 1970s deepened, the consequence of his Golden Triangle connection became undeniable. Western demand surged, Hong Kong's addicts multiplied, and law enforcement agencies on both sides of the Pacific set their sights on the man who had turned poppy fields into dynasties. And in the humid jungles of Burma, the same convoys continued to move, the smell of gun oil and raw poppies clinging to the night air. In the closing image of this chapter, the echo returns to the hills where it began. Armed men escort caravans under moonlight, their boots pressing into mudslick from monsoon rains. Radios hum faintly with American songs drifting through the dark, mingling with the distant chanting of farmers harvesting the next crop. Each convoy is a thread in Ung's invisible web, stretching from Shan State to Kowloon, from Kowloon to Harlem. And just as the humid air of the Golden Triangle once carried the scent of poppies and cordite, so too did it now carry the breath of an empire Ung had bound together, fragile, perilous, and destined to draw the full weight of the world's attention. Hong Kong, 1972. The colony's streets pulsed with commerce by day, yet beneath the neon glow of Nathan Road, the balance of power was cracking. Ung Sik-Ho's empire, vast and disciplined, had grown too large to ignore, and rivals within the 14K, as well as Vietnamese syndicates, sought to carve their own share of the trade. For years, Ung had avoided reckless bloodshed, preferring quiet control and precise intimidation. But in the feverish climate of the early 1970s, restraint gave way to open violence. The smell of diesel from buses, the perfume of tourists shopping in Tsim Sha Tsui arcades, and the bitter smoke of State Express 555 cigarettes carried by gang lookouts all mingled in the same crowded air, a deceptive calm that could be pierced by gunfire without warning. The broader context was unforgiving. The Vietnam War had created both markets and militias, flooding Hong Kong with displaced fighters who found a new trade in heroin. Vietnamese syndicates, hardened by years of conflict, now challenged Triad dominance on Ung's own turf. Within the 14K itself, fractures widened, with younger bosses bristling at Ung's command of routes and refineries. He was powerful, but the paradox of power is exposure. The higher he rose, the more visible the target on his back. Allegedly, one rival boss warned in a tea house, "No throne lasts forever in Kowloon." Police surveillance notes, 1972. The vivid moment that crystallized this era came one sweltering afternoon on Nathan Road. Shoppers browsed stalls of knockoff watches and radios. Cantonese pop blared from a street jukebox, and children licked melting ice lollies when a black sedan screeched to a halt. Gunmen emerged with pistols drawn, unleashing bursts of fire into a rival group. Screams tore through the heat, and when the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead, blood pooling beside discarded plastic bags of groceries. The South China Morning Post blared the next morning. Gangland feud erupts on Nathan Road, 3 dead. It was a headline that shocked a colony long accustomed to whispers of triad control, but unaccustomed to such brazen displays in broad daylight. The micro detail etched in one witness's memory was the way a single mahjong tile, dropped by a fleeing gambler, spun in the gutter beside a corpse, its clatter eerily louder than the echo of shots. Geographically, the violence stretched from Kowloon's crowded markets to the quieter lanes of Wan Chai, where nightclubs doubled as negotiation halls. In Sham Shui Po, Vietnamese gangs fought to control street-level dealing, their tactics ruthless and often indiscriminate. Police precincts swarmed with new reports, detectives flipping through typewritten witness statements while the clack of newsroom typewriters echoed across Hong Kong Island. A British superintendent admitted in frustration, "They no longer fear each other's knives, they compete with bullets now." Hong Kong Police Briefing, 1973. The escalation rattled, even hardened officers, for it suggested that Ng's careful discipline was no longer enough to contain the ambitions of others. Midway through this period, Ng's lieutenants tightened security. His driver, Ah Ming, adjusted routes daily, circling blocks before stopping outside clubhouses, his eyes always on rearview mirrors. Bodyguards wore tailored suits over concealed pistols, their jackets smelling faintly of mothballs and sweat. Calm as ever, continued his routines. But those close to him noted the subtle changes. Curtains drawn tighter at his Kowloon Tong home, meetings held in smaller circles, and a growing mistrust even of men who had once shared his table. Power in this climate demanded paranoia, and paranoia became his shield. The sensory midpoint of the 1970s underworld could be captured in its soundtrack. Transistor radios blaring Mandarin ballads, the shuffle of mahjong tiles in smoke-filled parlors, and the sudden hush when strangers entered a room. Loyalty was scarce, betrayal common, and Ng navigated these waters with the same precision that had built his empire. Yet each betrayal stung deeper. An associate arrested in 1971 turned informant, passing police details of Ng's shipments. Allegedly, Ng muttered afterward, "Men are cheaper than bullets." Witness recollection, 1975. It was a bitter reflection, hinting at both his reliance on expendability and his awareness that trust could no longer be bought with money alone. The broader organized crime landscape reflected this shift. Italian-American crime families in New York, dependent on steady supplies, grew nervous at the instability in Hong Kong. Newspapers in the United States warned of shortages driving prices higher, while Hong Kong papers described the colony as being caught in a wave of syndicate wars. For Ng, the stakes were both local and global. To lose control in Kowloon was to lose credibility with partners across the Pacific. His power status snapshot in these years was stark. He was still Hong Kong's heroin king, but his throne rested on a foundation now cracked by bullets and betrayals. By the close of 1973, the violence had scarred the colony's image. Tourists walked warily through Tsim Sha Tsui, and residents whispered of gangland executions in Sham Shui Po and To Kwa Wan. Colonial authorities launched public campaigns against triads, yet corruption within the police force blunted their effectiveness. Ng survived each wave, his resilience rooted in discipline, but the cost was mounting. Each assassination attempt reminded him of his mortality. Each betrayal reminded him of the fragility of power. And in the final image of this bloody era, the sensory echo returns to Nathan Road. Neon lights flicker against damp pavement. The smell of fried noodles lingers in the air, and passers-by glance nervously at idling cars, unsure if the next burst of gunfire will erupt without warning. The betrayal of trust and the clash of rivals had transformed Hong Kong into a stage where even a kingpin could no longer walk unchallenged. And as the night deepened, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next echo of shots to shatter its fragile calm. Kowloon Tong, 1973. Behind quiet villas shaded by banyan trees and guarded by steel gates, Sik-Ho presided over an empire of smoke that dwarfed anything Hong Kong had witnessed before. The colonial press spoke only in euphemisms, but those inside the trade knew the truth. Ng's syndicate was refining and moving as much as 10 tons of heroin each year, a torrent of white powder that stretched from hidden factories in Kowloon to the back alleys of New York and the barracks of Vietnam. The sensory world of these warehouses was unforgettable. The sting of acetone in the air, the hum of makeshift generators, workers in cotton undershirts stirring vats under the yellow light of bare bulbs, their gloves powdered white from product so pure it shimmered like snow. The broader context of the early 1970s fed his dominance. The Vietnam War had created legions of addicts, American soldiers who returned home carrying both trauma and habit, and the United States cities were drowning in demand. A Senate subcommittee on narcotics admitted in 1973 with chilling bluntness 90% of New York's heroin traces back to Hong Kong. For Ng, this was not a statistic, but a ledger line. Shipments moved through Victoria Harbour, disguised as electronics, textiles, or canned goods. The money flowed back in equal measure, mountains of cash laundered through Macau casinos and Hong Kong banks that asked no questions as long as the deposits arrived on time. The empire's power could be measured in geography as well as numbers. In Sham Shui Po, addicts slumped in alleys, their veins scarred, their whispers haunting. In Central, bankers toasted record profits, while Ng's funds mingled invisibly with legitimate investments. His warehouses in Kowloon Tong stood like silent fortresses, outwardly dull and grey, but within their walls sat millions in sealed heroin bricks, wrapped in wax paper and stamped with logos of tigers, eagles, or numbers. Brands of death that addicts in New York and Detroit could recognize instantly. The micro detail that defined his control was his insistence that each brick be weighed twice, once by the workers and once by his lieutenants, reflecting the paranoia of a man who trusted only verification. At the midpoint of this empire, the sensory details of Hong Kong life revealed the paradox. Tram bells clanged along Daewoo Road, Cantonese opera blared from tea-house radios, and children in Shek Kip Mei played football on dust fields. Yet in the shadows, heroin seeped into every corner. By 1972, estimates suggested 1 in 10 Hong Kong youth was addicted, a crisis that families whispered about but few dared to confront. Allegedly, Ng told a lieutenant over dinner, "The colony feeds itself with industry, but I feed it with hunger." Oral Recollection, 1985. It was both boast and confession, the worldview of a man who saw demand as destiny. Ng's contradictions sharpened with wealth. He drove his Rolls-Royce through Mongkok while children scavenged in rubbish heaps, yet he remained disciplined, never flaunting women or alcohol the way other bosses did. His power status snapshot at this height was simple. He was Hong Kong's invisible sovereign, his wealth and influence stretching further than many colonial administrators. At his side remained Ah Ming, the loyal driver, whose silent routines, polishing the car, circling streets before stopping, embodied the vigilance that insulated Ng from rivals who would happily see him fall. Their movements through the city were discreet, yet each arrival carried weight. When Ng entered a nightclub in Wan Chai, conversations hushed as though the air itself had shifted. The law could not ignore him forever. Colonial police noted the rise in public addiction, while American agencies pressed Hong Kong for action. In New York, headlines screamed of heroin epidemics, tracing their origins to the colony's syndicates. But Ng's empire was fortified by corruption. Police precincts in Tsim Sha Tsui and Mongkok received their envelopes, and even when raids occurred, the results were token seizures, leaving the real warehouses untouched. A British inspector remarked in frustration, "It was like trying to drain the sea with a bucket." Hong Kong police interview, 1974. The futility of their efforts only emboldened Ng's syndicate further. The sensory midpoint of his dominance could be heard in newsroom typewriters, hammering out stories of gangland killings and narcotics busts, while jukeboxes in seedy Wan Chai bars played Elvis Presley for drunk sailors who unknowingly drank above storerooms filled with heroin. Ng managed these contradictions with the calm of a strategist, knowing that panic was a weakness and that patience secured empires. His rivals grew bolder, but his wealth meant he could buy loyalty faster than bullets could kill it. Yet the consequences of this empire were undeniable. In the United States, addicts filled Harlem tenements, their bodies frail, their communities unraveling. In Hong Kong, parents wept silently as sons and daughters wasted away in squatter settlements. The empire of smoke was not abstract. It was measured in broken families, in blood on sidewalks, in hollow-eyed addicts staring at the ceiling of Kowloon dens. And still, Ng pressed forward. His syndicate refined heroin with near-industrial efficiency. their operations closer to factories than street gangs. He viewed himself less as a criminal and more as a merchant, one who saw opportunity where others saw taboo. Allegedly, when questioned by a trusted associate about the human toll, he replied, "It is the buyer who chooses poison, not the seller." Associate testimony, 1977. That reflection revealed both his justification and his blind spot, the cold detachment of a man who saw demand as absolution. As 1973 drew to a close, Ng stood at the height of his reign. The warehouses of Kowloon Tong brimmed with product, convoys moved seamlessly through Hong Kong's ports, and the money piled high enough to blur the lines between crime and commerce. Yet beneath the glitter of neon and the hum of prosperity, the colony trembled under the weight of his invisible hand. And in the closing echo of this chapter, the image returns to the warehouses themselves. Silent, windowless, reeking faintly of chemicals, their walls contained fortunes measured not in gold, but in powder. Inside, the hum of generators and the shuffle of workers' feet marked the rhythm of empire. Outside, the ordinary life of Kowloon carried on. School children laughing, radios crackling with Cantonese opera, the smell of roasted chestnuts on winter air. But behind those doors, Sik-Ho ruled an empire of smoke, and the colony itself breathed the fumes, whether it wished to or not. Hong Kong, 1974. The colony's glittering skyline concealed a quiet war, one waged not with gunfire in the streets, but with cameras hidden in briefcases, wires tucked beneath shirt collars, and notebooks filled with names written in code. Sik-Ho's empire had grown so vast that its very scale provoked a new response: the creation of the Narcotics Bureau, a specialized unit formed with British leadership and American intelligence support. For years, had walked as though untouchable, his Rolls-Royce gliding through Mongkok as smoothly as his shipments left Victoria Harbour. But in the sterile offices of Arsenal Street Police headquarters, detectives huddled over grainy stakeout photographs, their ashtrays filled with stubbed-out State Express 555 cigarettes, their eyes locked on the man they called the King of Heroin. The sensory details of this pursuit reflected a world shifting against him. Radios in unmarked cars buzzed with chatter as officers trailed his convoys, a smell of sweat and gasoline clinging to plainclothes men who spent nights in cramped vans watching Kowloon warehouses. Inside the bureau, typewriters clattered endlessly, their metallic rhythm punctuated by the hum of reel-to-reel tape recorders capturing wiretaps. The mid-1970s brought technology into the hunt. Conversations once whispered in tea houses on Portland Street now found their way onto spools of tape destined for analysis. Superintendent John Prendergast, one of the Bureau's most determined leaders, summarized their strategy with cutting precision. He thought he was untouchable. That made him careless. 1974. The turning point came when undercover agents began infiltrating Ng's syndicate, posing as dock workers and smugglers, their Cantonese fluent enough to pass, their nerves tested in the smoky dens of Kowloon Tong. They recorded the flow of heroin from hidden laboratories to the shipping companies Ng controlled. One vivid scene unfolded in a Shek Kip Mei tea house, where an undercover officer, his shirt damp with summer heat, sat across from a mid-level lieutenant and scribbled down prices on the back of a cigarette packet. The micro detail that captured the tension was his hand trembling slightly as he folded the packet into his pocket, aware that a single wrong word could expose him. Geographically, the investigation spanned the colony. In Wan Chai, surveillance teams shadowed Ng's lieutenants as they entered nightclubs thick with perfume and Mandarin ballads from jukeboxes. In Sham Shui Po, informants whispered details of shipments moving under cover of market stalls. In Kowloon Tong, long-lens cameras captured Ng entering nondescript warehouses, his suits crisp, his expression unreadable. The Bureau worked in coordination with American agents who had their own motives, desperate to stem the tide of heroin flooding into Harlem and the Bronx. US narcotics officials supplied intelligence, while Hong Kong police supplied manpower and local knowledge, each side aware that Ng had become more than a local problem. At the midpoint of this campaign, newspapers began to sense the tension. The South China Morning Post reported in 1974, Narcotics Bureau intensifies campaign against syndicates. Readers saw only official language, but inside the Bureau, the urgency was visceral. Files grew thick, photographs papered corkboards, and lines of red string connected names and addresses like a spider's web. Allegedly, one officer remarked, "Every road we followed ended with Ng's shadow." Oral testimony, 1982. Ng, however, remained disciplined. He continued to dine quietly in Kowloon restaurants, His bodyguard, Ming, always nearby, eyes scanning doorways, hand never far from his jacket pocket. Suspected surveillance, yet trusted in the corruption he had long cultivated within the police. For years, envelopes of cash had brought silence, and old habits die slowly. But as new officers trained under British and American methods replaced the older guard, the wall of protection began to thin. Ng's mindset in these years blended confidence with unease. He knew his empire was too large to dismantle easily, but he also knew the net was drawing tighter. The sensory midpoint of this hunt revealed its slow burn intensity. Detectives crouched in dark rooms, the smell of chemical developer heavy in the air as photographs of Ng's warehouses emerged on paper. Wiretap rooms echoed with muffled voices speaking of shipments, numbers, and places, words that to an outsider meant nothing, but to investigators meant evidence. The Bureau did not need to match his wealth. They needed only patience, the one currency Ng himself had always mastered. Now that weapon was being used against him. The consequences of this relentless pressure began to show. Mid-level operatives were arrested in routine raids, their silence secured at first, but their resolve cracking under interrogation. Informants, once dismissed as unreliable, now fed the Bureau with details that matched the wiretaps. American officials pressed harder, warning that Washington would not tolerate a colonial government turning a blind eye while New York drowned in heroin. The broader organized crime landscape was shifting too. Italian-American families, who once welcomed Ng's supply lines, began to worry about disruption, their business too reliant on a single source under siege. By 1975, the outlines of a case were forming. Detectives believed they had mapped his network from Shan State laboratories to Hong Kong distribution hubs, and though Ng remained insulated, the threads now converged. His paranoia deepened. Curtains were drawn earlier, meetings shortened, and only the most trusted were allowed near. Allegedly, he confessed to a confidant, "The walls have ears, and they are closing in." Associate Testimony, 1978. That line reflected not just suspicion, but recognition, the dawning awareness that discipline might not be enough to resist the weight of a government determined to end him. And in the closing echo of this chapter, the image returns to the detectives themselves. In a dimly lit bureau office, Prendergast and his team leaned over a table scattered with photographs. Ng leaving warehouses, at nightclub entrances, shaking hands with men later arrested. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and coffee gone cold. The soundtrack, the steady whir of a tape recorder capturing voices in Cantonese. On one photo, Prendergast tapped his pen against Ng's face and muttered the thought that had driven them for years, that even kings could fall. In that moment, the empire of smoke stood vast and still, untouchable. But the photographs, wires, and whispered testimonies foretold the inevitable reckoning. Hong Kong, 1974. The monsoon season left the streets of Kowloon slick with rain. Neon lights reflected in puddles like broken jewels. And amid this familiar rhythm, the colony was about to witness a rupture that would echo across oceans. For years, Sik-Ho had walked as though beyond reach, his empire of heroin operating in silence while investigators built their net in shadows. Now, on an otherwise unremarkable morning, the Narcotics Bureau prepared to strike at the heart of that empire, their target a nondescript go-down tucked between warehouses near the harbour. The air smelled of damp concrete and diesel as unmarked vans rolled into position, their engines idling quietly, their occupants gripping warrant papers with fingers stained from hours of cigarettes smoked in anticipation. The raid itself unfolded with calculated speed. Steel shutters clattered as officers forced their way inside, their flashlights cutting across stacks of crates labelled as textiles and machine parts. What they uncovered was no ordinary contraband. Bricks of heroin, sealed in wax paper and stamped with familiar logos, filled the room wall to wall, over 1,200 pounds in total. The acrid scent of chemical residue lingered in the air, mingling with the dust as the officers pried open crate after crate. One veteran detective, staring at the mountain of powder, later admitted he felt dizzy, not from the fumes, but from the realization that this single room held a fortune larger than Hong Kong's annual education budget. The South China Morning Post headline the next day screamed in bold print, $350 million, heroin haul breaks syndicate. The sensory shock of the discovery could not be overstated. Reporters invited to photograph the seizure clicked their cameras furiously, the pop of flashbulbs bouncing off the pale bricks of heroin stacked like tombstones. The sight was grotesquely orderly, each block wrapped and labelled, as though death itself had been industrialized and stored for shipment. A micro detail captured by one journalist described an officer brushing powder from his uniform trousers. the white dust clinging stubbornly to the dark wool fabric like a mark of Cain. For the Bureau, the bust was more than a record. It was the proof they needed that Ung, the man they had pursued through wiretaps, informants, and endless stakeouts, was no longer untouchable. Geographically, the raid rooted itself in Kowloon, but its consequences rippled globally. In Bangkok and Saigon, syndicate partners heard the news with dread, recognizing that their Hong Kong artery had been severed. In New York, narcotics officials whispered that their most persistent source had finally been struck. And in Hong Kong itself, where families had watched sons and daughters fall to heroin addiction, the headlines carried an unspoken sigh of relief. Yet on the streets of Sham Shui Po and Mong Kok, addicts still shuffled in alleys, their bodies trembling, proof that the empire Ung built could not be dismantled in a single night. At the center of the storm was Ung himself. He was arrested not in violence but in silence, escorted into custody as cameras recorded his fall. He wore a tailored suit, its shoulders slightly damp from the humidity, his expression composed but distant. To those who knew him, the contradiction was striking. A man who had once commanded billions reduced to a solitary figure flanked by officers in plain uniforms. Superintendent John Prendergast, the Bureau's relentless pursuer, stood before reporters and declared the significance of the moment. Allegedly, he said, "This is not just a seizure, it is the collapse of a dynasty." Press briefing, 1974. The words were heavy with triumph, but also caution, for dynasties rarely crumble without aftershocks. At the midpoint of this downfall, the sensory world shifted to the press conference. Typewriters hammered in newsrooms across the colony, producing copy for evening editions, while radios carried the announcement in clipped British tones. The smell of ink and paper in the South China Morning Post offices carried into thousands of homes by dawn, the headline itself a weapon against Ung's aura of invincibility. For the first time, the public saw him not as a distant shadow, but as a man in chains, dwarfed by the very product that had elevated him. One associate, reflecting years later, recalled Ung's bitter remark, "They parade me with heroin like a trophy, but they forget who built the hunger." Oral testimony, 1983. It was both defiance and resignation, the philosophy of a man who believed demand had always been the true culprit. The broader organized crime landscape reeled. The Golden Triangle warlords, Kunsa among them, tightened their operations, wary of further exposure. American agencies praised the bust, but knew the pipeline would reroute. Heroin empires rarely died, they adapted. Within Hong Kong, rival Triads smelled opportunity, the absence of Ung's dominance tempting others to claim his territories. Yet in that moment, as he was photographed before stacks of heroin, Ung stood as the embodiment of a truth larger than himself, that the colony had become the central artery of a global plague, and that even its king could be brought low. The power status snapshot of Ung after the raid was stark. Once regarded as Hong Kong's godfather, he was now a prisoner awaiting trial, his fortune frozen, his influence diminished, but not extinguished. His driver Ah Ming, who had ferried him through countless nights of danger, was seen standing silently outside the courthouse, his cigarette trembling slightly between his fingers, a symbol of loyalty that even collapse could not erase. And in the closing echo of this chapter, the scene returns to the warehouse. Empty now, its crates removed, its walls scarred by the dust of heroin long swept away, it stood as a hollow monument to ambition undone. The air still carried a faint chemical smell, absorbed into the concrete, a ghost of the empire that had once filled it. Outside, the city of Hong Kong carried on, tram bells clanging, street hawkers shouting prices, jukeboxes playing Cantonese pop in Wan Chai bars. But in the quiet of that warehouse lingered the memory of the record seizure, the moment when the king of heroin was unmasked and his empire revealed not as invincible, but as fragile as powder. Hong Kong, 1975. The colony's high court stood like a fortress of colonial stone on Queensway, and for months its halls became the stage of a spectacle unseen in the city's history. Sik-Ho, the man once spoken of only in whispers as the king of heroin, now sat in the dock under the unflinching gaze of judges in powdered wigs. The air in the courtroom carried the faint musk of polished wood and ink-stained paper, punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the coughs of reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder. Outside, typewriters clattered in newspaper offices across Hong Kong, their keys striking out headlines that would define an era. The charges were as vast as his empire, drug trafficking and criminal conspiracy on a scale so great that prosecutors described it as industrialized crime. The Crown laid out the evidence like a mosaic, each fragment of wiretap, photograph, and testimony forming a picture of a man who had turned heroin into a global commodity. Witnesses were brought in under protection, their faces pale with fear, their voices trembling as they described factories in Kowloon Tong and shipments hidden in crates bound for North America. One vivid moment came when a mid-level operative, escorted by armed police, pointed across the courtroom and said simply, "That man gave the orders." The silence that followed was heavy enough to still even the shuffling of Clark's papers. The sensory weight of the trial extended beyond the courtroom. Crowds gathered daily on Queensway, their murmurs blending with the whine of trams and the smell of roasted chestnuts sold by hawkers hoping to profit from the spectacle. Some came to gawk, others to curse, and still others to glimpse the man who had shaped their city's darkest trade. The South China Morning Post captured the mood in a 1975 headline: "Triad boss faces justice in record drug case." It was a statement of fact, yet for many in the colony, it was also a test. Could the law reach a figure whose shadow had stretched over Hong Kong for decades? Inside, the drama was both legal and psychological. Ng sat with composure, his suits tailored, his hair neatly combed, his expression betraying neither fear nor defiance. Observers noted the micro detail of how he folded his hands in his lap, as if still in command of his own calm. Yet behind the surface, prosecutors alleged bribery attempts, offers of cash to sway testimony or silence informants. For the first time, the discipline that had shielded him seemed frayed, the tools of corruption less reliable in a courtroom where the world was watching. Allegedly, he remarked to a confidant, "Money moves men, but it cannot move walls." Associate Testimony, 1980. It was a rare concession to the inevitability pressing down upon him. At the midpoint of the trial, geographical anchors underscored the scale of his downfall. In Mongkok, addicts still gathered in alleyways, their veins marked by his product. In New York, Senate hearings continued to cite Hong Kong as the artery of America's heroin crisis. A US law enforcement briefing, circulated in 1975, declared, Sik-Ho's network ties Southeast Asian production directly to Western streets. The global stage had turned its eyes on a colonial courtroom, and in that convergence, Ng's empire was laid bare. For his defenders, the case was a battle against inevitability. His barristers argued the evidence was circumstantial, the testimonies unreliable, the seizures insufficient to link directly to their client. Yet the prosecution pressed forward with patience, each document and photograph presented like a nail in the coffin. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, the scratch of pens blending with the drone of ceiling fans stirring the humid air. In newsrooms, linotype machines stamped headlines while jukeboxes in Wan Chai bars played the latest Mandarin ballads, their melodies masking conversations about the trial that now consumed the colony. Ng's contradictions deepened with every passing day. To his supporters, he remained disciplined, never raising his voice, never slouching in defeat. To prosecutors, he was the architect of misery, a man who had profited from addiction while destroying families from Kowloon to the Bronx. His power status snapshot during the trial was stark. Once Hong Kong's untouchable kingpin, he was now a defendant isolated by walls and guarded by armed officers, his empire reduced to exhibits and testimony. The verdict came in 1976. The courtroom was silent as Judge Blair Kerr read the sentence, his voice resonant beneath the high ceilings. "You have brought misery to tens of thousands. The law will show no mercy." With those words, Ng's fate was sealed. 30 years in Stanley Prison, the longest drug sentence ever handed down in Hong Kong. Reporters sprinted to telephones, their voices urgent as they dictated copy for evening editions. The South China Morning Post ran the headline before sunset. Heroin King, sentenced to 30 years, court issues stern warning. The sensory closing of this chapter carried the weight of finality. Ng was led away in chains, the clink of iron echoing against the stone corridors, the faint smell of mothballs clinging to the prison-issue clothing awaiting him. Outside, the streets of Hong Kong carried on. Tram bells clanged, children played football in Shek Kip Mei, and in Wan Chai bars, sailors dropped coins into jukeboxes. Yet within the High Court, the memory lingered. The man once seen as untouchable had been judged and condemned, his empire dismantled brick by brick in the language of the law. And as the heavy doors closed behind him, the echo returned to the opening image, the fortress-like High Court, now less a stage of spectacle than a monument to inevitability. The king of heroin, who once folded banknotes with precision and moved billions in silence, had been reduced to a prisoner whose every movement was scripted by others. The law had shown no mercy. And in that mercilessness, Hong Kong declared that even empires built on smoke could be brought down by the weight of stone. Stanley, Hong Kong, 1976. The storm clouds gathered above the jagged cliffs of the island's southern edge, their shadows stretching across the forbidding silhouette of Stanley Prison. Built in 1937 by the British, its granite walls rose against the sea winds like a fortress, grim and immovable, the perfect stage for the fall of a king. Here, Sik-Ho began what was meant to be 3 decades of confinement, a sentence that reduced the godfather of Hong Kong heroin to a number in a registry. The gates clanged shut behind him, with a sound both metallic and final, echoing through corridors that smelled of damp stone and disinfectant. Yet even in chains, carried himself with the same composure that had once commanded armies of men. Inside, the rhythm of prison life was harshly simple. The clatter of iron bowls at dawn, the scratch of brushes on concrete floors, the stale scent of boiled cabbage drifting from the mess hall, and the hollow clang of bars locking at dusk. Most men shrank under its weight, but adapted quickly, folding the monotony into his discipline. Fellow inmates described him as calm and calculating, his voice never raised, his movements deliberate. A prison officer told the South China Morning Post in 1985, even in prison, he carried himself like a general. That quiet authority gave him influence that extended beyond his cell. Whispers among inmates suggested that still pulled strings, that his orders reached the outside through coded letters and visiting family members. Allegedly, small favors were traded on his behalf, an associate quietly promoted in the 14K, a shipment redirected, a rival's influence blunted. He was not orchestrating an empire in full, but the aura of his name lingered strong enough to command obedience. The micro detail that revealed his continued control was his posture in the exercise yard, standing slightly apart, hands clasped behind his back, younger prisoners drifting toward him, not out of force, but deference. Even stripped of wealth, his presence shaped the hierarchy inside Stanley's walls. By the midpoint of his sentence, Hong Kong itself had changed. The late 1970s brought reforms, the creation of the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and a crackdown on the very networks that had once sheltered On the outside, the heroin trade persisted, but newer figures emerged, bolder and more violent, their methods louder than Ng's quiet efficiency. Within Stanley, became an object of study rather than fear. Journalists speculated about his role, with one 1982 headline declaring, "Heroin King lives quietly in Stanley, but influence suspected." Geographically, Stanley's isolation reinforced the myth. Perched on the tip of Hong Kong Island, it was both prison and monastery, a place where time slowed even as the city it overlooked surged forward. The sensory midpoint of his prison years revealed a world far removed from Rolls-Royces and mahjong parlors. Radios crackled faintly in the guard stations, broadcasting Teresa Teng's Mandarin ballads, their sweetness contrasting with the sour stench of laundry drying in crowded cells. Read newspapers daily, circling stories with stub pencils and allegedly commenting quietly to fellow inmates on global affairs, from Nixon's resignation to the Sino-British talks on Hong Kong's future. "The world moves in circles," he was overheard saying in 1984, "but money always finds its way." Fellow prisoner testimony, 1990. Even in confinement, his worldview remained mercantile, a lens through which he judged not only heroin, but politics and history itself. Secondary figures from his past also faded into shadows. His driver Ming, who had once ferried him through Kowloon nights, visited rarely, wary of police surveillance. But when he did, guards noted the quiet respect with which he addressed never as a prisoner, always as a leader. That loyalty, though muted, symbolized the enduring web of bonds had woven. His power status snapshot inside Stanley was unambiguous. He was not a king, but he remained a general, a man obeyed in whispers, deferred to even by those who had no reason to fear him. Yet contradictions haunted him. Discipline kept his demeanor intact, but confinement eroded the edges of his empire. He knew that heroin markets had evolved, that new suppliers in Southeast Asia and rivals within Hong Kong now controlled the trade. His ambition had built a dynasty of smoke, but time was dismantling it in ways no raid could achieve. Prison stripped him not only of freedom, but of relevance, and this was perhaps the punishment he least expected. By the mid-1980s, the myth of persisted outside Stanley, even as the man himself aged within it. Law enforcement officers spoke of him as a relic, a cautionary tale to new generations of traffickers. An officer who had guarded him noted, "He never begged, never broke routine. His strength was composure." SCMP interview, 1985. For the public, Ng's name still carried menace, but increasingly it was spoken in the past tense, overshadowed by new figures like Broken Tooth Khoi in Macau. The sensory close of his prison years carried the weight of time itself, the clang of metal doors, the shuffle of prisoners' slippers on concrete floors, the musty smell of monsoon air trapped inside stone corridors, all became the soundtrack of Ng's life. At night, when storms rolled over Stanley, the prison's walls shook with thunder, a reminder of the city beyond, alive and restless, yet out of reach. And in the closing echo of this chapter, the storm outside the prison walls mirrored the storm that had once defined his reign. Stanley Prison stood stark against the sky, its granite walls unchanged even as the man inside withered. Sik-Ho, who once commanded heroin routes across continents, now measured his days in the rattle of keys and the rhythm of prison bells. Yet even here, the aura of the general endured, a man stripped of empire but not of presence, his fall marked not only by bars and stone, but by the quiet respect he continued to command in the shadows of confinement. Stanley Prison, Hong Kong, 1981. Beyond the grey seawalls, the city pulsed with new energy, neon buzzing above Nathan Road, cassette shops blaring Alan Tam ballads, and the metallic tang of Marlboro smoke drifting out of packed mahjong parlours. Yet within the stone corridors, Sik-Ho was aging into obsolescence. The empire he once commanded was dissolving piece by piece, its roots overtaken, its loyalties eroded. For 2 decades, Hong Kong's heroin trade had carried his name like a brand, but the 1980s brought a new tide of traffickers, harder to trace and far more ruthless. The first sign came from the Golden Triangle. Kunsa, the Shan warlord operating from the jungles of Burma, rose as the undisputed supplier of Southeast Asian heroin. His convoys of mules and guerrilla fighters flooded Thailand's borders, eclipsing the carefully balanced networks had nurtured. A former associate visiting Stanley in 1982 later recalled, knew his time was over. He said the jungle had swallowed the city. Alleged inmate testimony, 1987. Ng's calm demeanour never wavered, but the words revealed his awareness that the heroin trade no longer required Hong Kong's middlemen in the way it once had. By mid-decade, the transformation was visible in the city's streets. Hong Kong's once notorious opium divans were already history, and now heroin itself began losing ground to methamphetamine pills smuggled from Thailand and Taiwan. The sensory fabric of the era was unmistakable. Radios in corner, Dai Pai dongs, blaring cantopop. Young men in nylon jackets and white trainers flicking lighters over bottles of San Miguel, the acrid sting of Phi Jai pills crushed on tinfoil. It was a different drug culture, faster, cheaper, and designed for a younger generation. The South China Morning Post declared in 1986, synthetic highs rise as heroin declines, signaling that Ng's currency, heroin bricks wrapped in waxed paper, was becoming antiquated in a shifting market. Ng's power status snapshot in this decade was stark. Once the king of Kowloon go-downs, now a relic behind bars. Name whispered more by historians than by hustlers. Midway through the decade, in Macau, the flamboyant figure of Wan Kwok Khoi, better known as Broken Tooth, was beginning his ascent in the 14K Triad. Where had ruled with quiet calculation, Broken Tooth thrived in spectacle, throwing casino banquets and appearing in local gangster films. That generational shift was geographic as well as cultural. Hong Kong's heroin syndicates lost primacy as Macau's triads leveraged casinos and synthetic drugs. And Stanley, adapted to his diminishing relevance with the same composure that had long defined him. He still read newspapers daily, tracing his fingertip along headlines about the Sino-British Joint Declaration and Reagan's war on drugs. But now his interest was more detached, like a historian reviewing his own obituary. At one visit in 1988, his nephew recalled him saying, "Power is not lost all at once. It fades like ink in the sun." Family interview, 1995. Even in defeat, he spoke with a strategist's cadence, turning personal collapse into an abstract observation on time. The geographical re-anchor of this story lies again in Kowloon. Argyle Street Police Headquarters, once the hub for anti-narcotics operations against now shifted attention toward international cooperation with the DEA. as American officials tied the Golden Triangle's output directly to US addiction rates. A 1989 DEA report summarized bluntly, "The age of Hong Kong heroin kingpins is closing." That phrase became the eulogy of Ng's generation, a verdict as much about global politics as about personal downfall. The vivid cinematic moment came in 1989, when officers at Kai Tak Airport displayed a seizure of methamphetamine tablets from Thailand on a long wooden table, photographers' flashes ricocheting off the polished floor. To younger reporters, this was the story of the future. To Ng, reading the coverage inside Stanley, it was confirmation that his empire, built on powdered heroin, was an artifact of another time. The micro detail that captured his irrelevance was simple. Younger prisoners in Stanley no longer recognized his name. They knew Kun Sa, they had heard of Broken Tooth, but Ng was merely the old man with a slow stride, folding his South China Morning Post carefully after reading. Respect lingered in his posture, but fear was gone. By the early 1990s, Hong Kong itself was preparing for its own handover, and Ng's life mirrored the city's transformation. Just as British colonial rule approached its end, so too did the reign of the old heroin barons. The narcotics economy that once propped up syndicates like Ng's had been replaced by synthetic drugs, by casino triads, by globalization's shifting currents. Had become a relic, his empire reduced to memory, his name no longer whispered in tea houses but footnoted in narcotics reports. The sensory close of his decline was as quiet as the opening was storm-laden. In Stanley's courtyard, under the damp smell of moss-covered stone, Ng shuffled across the cracked concrete as rain tapped against tin gutters, the faint sound of Teresa Teng's "Goodbye, My Love" floating from a distant guard's radio. The song belonged to a decade of transition, and its melancholy matched the man who had once ruled Hong Kong's heroin trade. And so the fall of an era ended not with gunfire or betrayal, but with silence. The city outside reinvented itself under neon lights. The heroin syndicates gave way to flashier airs, and Ng remained behind the walls of Stanley, a ghost of a brutal age. The storm that had once carried his empire had dissipated into drizzle, leaving only the echo of a time when Hong Kong's godfathers dictated the flow of narcotics across the world, and the quiet truth that no empire, no matter how powerful, can outlive the tide of history. Hong Kong, 1991. The city that once ran on his narcotics now pulsed to a different rhythm. Neon karaoke bars along Portland Street, echoing with Anita Mui's ballads. The smell of roasted chestnuts curling from Nathan Road stalls, and the clipped urgency of commuters racing toward the approaching handover. But inside Queen Mary Hospital, the former king of heroin lay wasting away, his body hollowed by liver cancer, his empire long dismantled. For Ng Sik-Ho, freedom came not through triumph but through medical parole, a quiet mercy extended to a man who had once dictated the flow of poison across continents. Released from Stanley Prison after 15 years, he walked the city one final time, not as a ruler, but as a relic. Those who caught glimpses of him in early 1991 recalled a figure transformed. No longer the immaculately pressed suits of his Kowloon prime, but a frail man in loose cotton shirts, skin the color of parchment, moving with the slow precision of someone measuring out his last days. A nephew later said, he looked less like a general, more like a monk, silent, resigned. Family interview, 1993. His power status snapshot had inverted. Once feared in every tea house and nightclub, now diminished to a patient clinging to morphine for relief. Yet even in decline, he carried himself with the old composure, a faint shadow of command still etched in his eyes. On August mornings that summer, the sound of cantopop drifting from radios and Sham Shui Po tea houses contrasted with whispered news that Ng was close to death. Police and journalists alike monitored his condition, sensing his passing would mark more than the end of a man. It would close the chapter of Hong Kong's heroin age. When the announcement finally came, Ming Pao Daily ran the stark headline, Ng Sik-Ho dies at 65, from king of heroin to prisoner. The phrasing captured the arc of his life, from the empire of go-downs and syndicate alliances to the confinement of Stanley's walls, ending not with a violent shootout or betrayal, but with the slow erosion of disease. His funeral became one of the most watched events of the decade's underworld calendar. At a Kowloon funeral parlor, white wreaths crowded the entrance, their chrysanthemums heavy with perfume that mingled with the acrid smoke of Double Happiness cigarettes lit nervously outside. Triad elders arrived in black suits, silent, nodding to one another in gestures of coded respect, while plainclothes officers observed from across the street, cameras hidden beneath folded newspapers. One officer later recalled, "Even dead, he drew both fear and fascination." Hong Kong Narcotics Bureau interview, 1991. The vivid cinematic moment came as pallbearers lifted his coffin draped in simple white silk, the silence broken only by the clatter of taxis idling outside. A micro-detail told its own story. Tucked among the wreaths was a small wooden plaque from an unnamed associate, its calligraphy reading only Brother Ho. To the public, he was the notorious Sik-Ho, the heroin king. But to those who once stood in his shadow, he remained Brother, a title binding them to a past they could neither renounce nor revive. The geographical re-anchor of this moment lay in Kowloon itself, the streets where his empire once thrived. Shanghai Street's back alleys, the bustling lanes of Mongkok, were by then dominated by younger syndicates and synthetic drug peddlers. As was laid to rest, one Kwok Koi, broken tooth, was already splashing his reputation across Macau, embodying a flashier, more cinematic generation of gangsters. The age of quiet, calculating heroin barons had given way to flamboyant casino triads, confirming that Ng's death was both personal and symbolic. Inside the parlor, amid the flicker of incense sticks, an old driver who had once chauffeured him through Kowloon in a black Mercedes muttered, "The boss died standing, even when lying down." Associate testimony, 1991. It was a contradiction that defined him, frail in flesh but unbroken in bearing, dethroned yet never humiliated. For the triad world, his passing was a reminder of mortality, of the inevitability that no syndicate, no matter how entrenched, could resist the turning of decades. As the cortege wound its way toward the cemetery, Hong Kong's skyline loomed in the distance, cranes reshaping the city in anticipation of 1997. In the soundscape of the day came the faint hum of traffic along Nathan Road, mingling with the chant of monks, and above it all the muted crackle of police radios tracking the funeral. It was an atmosphere both mournful and watchful, grief threaded with suspicion, reverence shadowed by surveillance. In the end, Ng's death closed more than a life. It sealed an era. The heroin economy that had once defined Hong Kong's underworld was finished, replaced by synthetics and globalized trafficking routes. His name, once shorthand for power and fear, now belonged to newspaper archives and whispered nostalgia among aging triad veterans. As the final incense stick burned low, its smoke curling into the heavy summer air, it carried the same quiet weight as the opening of that year had carried, the sound of a city moving forward while one of its most infamous sons faded into history. Hong Kong, late 1990s. The neon blaze of Mongkok was already fading, its once dazzling signs sputtering against the encroaching glow of global chains and redevelopment. Yet beneath the modern skyline, shadows told a different story. Silhouettes of addicts hunched in stairwells, the acrid smell of cheap heroin substitutes lingering in the humid night air. The king of heroin was dead, but the scars he left across the city remained raw, woven into the fabric of its streets, families, and institutions. His empire of poison had collapsed, but its echoes survived in whispered legends, in criminal law, and in the reshaped vigilance of Hong Kong's law enforcement. By the mid-1990s, a younger generation no longer remembered the man's face, but carried the weight of his legacy in their families. Thousands who had come of age in the 1970s and 1980s bore the consequences of his empire, lost siblings, hollow-eyed parents, and neighborhoods permanently branded as the breeding grounds of addiction. Hong Kong narcotics historian Ko Lin Chin reflected in 1999, Sik-Ho built an empire on the ruin of a generation. His remark was more than academic. It was a ledger entry in blood and smoke. The power status snapshot of Ng's myth was clear. Though gone, he remained the yardstick against which every future gangster would be measured. Midway through that decade, as the city braced for the 1997 handover, the legacy of was everywhere. Along Nathan Road, addicts still clutched red pagoda cigarettes while waiting for methadone doses at government clinics. And in Tsim Sha Tsui, neon karaoke bars masked the despair of those who had once chased the high of his imported heroin. Police files from the era contained photographs of young men with needle scars, captioned in terse language that carried decades of institutional fatigue. South China Morning Post ran a feature in 1996. Heroin's ghost still haunts Kowloon, a headline that linked directly back to the syndicates had once commanded. Law enforcement, hardened by his reign, had transformed itself into a permanent bulwark. The Narcotics Bureau, which had once been reactive and underfunded, grew into one of Asia's most sophisticated drug enforcement units. A retired officer admitted in 2001, every raid after him felt like chasing his shadow. Hong Kong Police Oral History Project. His micro-detail lingered in the institutional psyche. Mugshots of Ung, once pinned above desks in the Narcotics Bureau, yellowed over time, but were never removed, a silent reminder of what unchecked power looked like. The underworld itself had also shifted. By the late 1990s, synthetic drugs and new triad leaders like Broken Tooth Wan Kwok Koi in Macau symbolized a different, flashier criminal era. To the older generation of triad elders, however, Ung remained a mythic figure. One aging associate, speaking anonymously in 2005, remarked, "He ruled like an emperor, and emperors don't vanish, they become legend." Such words revealed the contradiction at the heart of his legacy. Despised by the public, romanticized by the underworld, and studied obsessively by law enforcement. The geographical re-anchor came in Mongkok itself. Walking through Sai Yung Choi Street in the 2000s, among shops blasting cantopop from portable stereos, it was impossible not to see the faint imprint of his empire. The very go-downs, once filled with Southeast Asian heroin, had been converted into electronics arcades and budget hostels. Yet older residents still pointed at their doorways with unease, recalling the police vans that had parked there decades earlier. In those spaces, memory remained as potent as any drug. His contradictions defined his legacy. Had been a man of discipline and calculation, yet he presided over chaos and ruin. He sought to command respect like a general, but his empire thrived on addiction, desperation, and exploitation. His myth was both cautionary tale and underworld gospel, proof that one man could reshape an entire city's destiny for nearly 2 decades. By the present day, his story exists less in lived memory than in the architecture of Hong Kong's identity, in documentaries, in academic studies, and in the whispered stories of aging gangsters. His name still surfaces. The addicts he left behind, the police structures he forced into existence, and the families fractured by his heroin tell a truth beyond myth. His legacy is not in gold or territory, but in the human wreckage of a city that once bent under his will. As the neon of Mongkok flickers one last time, the silhouettes of addicts merge with the city's nightscape, a haunting reminder that even decades after his death, the empire of Sik-Ho still breathes in Hong Kong's streets.